climate finance for transformational adaptation and loss and damage action. And I'm almost proud that we managed to find a headline for the side event without any acronym. So I think that's worth a short applause, please. And you may also see that a couple of organizations have come together to organize this side event. And while we sometimes maybe feel a bit of pain by being forced to merge side events, it also always forces us to be innovative and bring together stakeholders or institutions which otherwise might not have joined. And that's, I think, is something very interesting also about this side event. So there are 3 organizations mainly hosting, CAN Europe, CAN International, and DEval, but all of the speakers you see on the list are basically from partner organizations, so it's a big group of organizations which came together to host this side event. My name is Sven Hameling. I work with CARE International, and I will introduce the first set of speakers and facilitate the conversation a bit. But after almost half of the session, we will switch the panel a little bit and shift the focus to a new set of speakers and also facilitators. But in order for you to understand the logic of this switch and also the overall structure of the event, let me briefly introduce you to what we are trying to discuss today and also trying to achieve. So I think we basically all know about the challenge that there's too little finance for adaptation and loss and damage, and that's a big topic of discussion not only this week but for years, I would say, and will be a big topic in Dubai as well. So scale of finance is one key issue, and in the first set of inputs, which will come from Marlene Achoki from CAN International and Rachel Simon from CAN Europe, we will focus a bit more on the gap of finance by looking into basically what developed countries have recently reported under their official Article 9.5 climate finance projections, but also looking into what are potential opportunities, potential innovative sources which could generate new and additional finance to basically serve some of the adaptation and loss and damage needs in vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries in the global south. And I think we're probably all are aware that reducing the gap in climate finance from a quantitative perspective is absolutely essential given the challenges that many countries face, the big financial constraints, the impacts from the climate crisis, but also the interlinkages with other crisis moments, whether it's price increases in food, in energy sources, whether it's other types of constraints, fiscal constraints, etc. So that will be a bit of the first part of the conversation, and you will also have the opportunity to raise questions to the speakers and contribute. And then in the second half, we'll turn a little bit more into, let's say, some of the qualitative aspects that have emerged on how to, basically advance adaptation towards transformational action. And we have various speakers and contributors in the panel discussion later on, bringing different scientific perspectives, practical experience from an institution like the GCF, for example, and so we also look forward to have that second part of the panel. So with that, I would like to hand over to Marlene Achoki from CARE International for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Sven, for that introduction. And yeah, I'm Marlene Achoki. I work with CARE as the Global Policy Co-Lead, Climate Justice, and I'm based in Nairobi. So the report's hollow commitments that we're going to share the findings of the report, which is not yet actually launched. It's still embargoed until 14th of June. So you will get the full report on 14th. But for now, we are going to share with you the outcomes of the analysis that we've done on the commitment of the developed countries to send reports to the UNFCCC on biannual reporting on how much they're actually contributing to climate finance. So the whole, what we did with the report is looking into the different biannual reports under Article 9, Paragraph 5, which actually the countries are committed to share their reports biannually to show how are they progressing with contributing climate finance to the different resources whereby the developing countries or the vulnerable countries will be able to access that finance to build their resilience to climate change. So this is the second report that we have done. We did the first report in 2021, looking at the biannual reports from 2019-2020, and then we launched the report in 2021. And the current HOLO Commitments 2023 report is captured from the figures that were done for the last 2 years, 2020, 2021, 2022, and then the report coming out in 2023. Next slide, please. So we have a set of criteria that we used to develop the report. And the 5 criteria is basically brought together, collected from the CMA reports under the Article 9 on how the climate finance should look like. And therefore, we brought all the elements together and come up with the 5 criteria. So each criteria garners 4 points. So in total, the report, the countries, we have analyzed the countries within 20 points. So the first criteria is future of level supports. How are the countries indicating the quantitative data on how they'll be supporting the developing countries in terms of future level of support? As mandated or as committed, should be able to increase after every report that they submit. Also looking at the balance between adaptation and mitigation support. We are seeing a very huge gap in terms of how adaptation finance and also mitigation finance is being dispersed through different programs and projects. And therefore, one of the key criteria that we are looking at is how the developed countries are actually intentionally providing finance towards adaptation, but also mitigation in the aim of creating the balance between the two. We are also looking at we use the criteria on priority for the most vulnerable. What are the different criteria that the developed countries have set on board or have to ensure that the climate finance they provide are actually reaching the local communities, the women and girls, and how is it proper to ensure that it's able to reach the people who need it the most? The fourth criteria is climate finance. How is it new and additional? On top of the 0.7 ODA that the developed countries do provide. So how is it new and additional? We have, you'll see as we proceed in the report, there are already countries where the finance is actually like about 1.7, that is 1% higher than the ODA. So that is what we mean by new and additional on top of the ODA that the countries are already providing. And finally, plans for mobilizing of private climate finance in future. We are seeing a lot of these discussions in the TC Transitional Committee, discussions on loss and damage. What are the different private climate finance that will be mobilized to ensure that we have kind of blended climate finance to support the vulnerable countries. So quickly, in terms of overall assessment of the report, and the assessment, basically we are comparing it to the first HOLO Commitment report that was published in 2021. And we are seeing that there's improved reporting from the different years. We are seeing more quantitative information from the countries. Although the countries are using their own methodologies, there's no like an indicated or clear methodology set aside for the parties or the developed countries to actually indicate how they report the quantitative information. But we can see some countries have actually come out and say, we will provide, let's say, 11 billion, and 20% of this would go towards adaptation, and the rest will go towards mitigation. So there's more of improved reporting in terms of quantitative data, which is a good progress because we are able to really see how much finance is going to mitigation, how much is going to adaptation, and therefore we are able, it's more predictable, and there's a lot of more transparency in that aspect. Yes, countries are using their own methodologies, so it's quite there's no like one methodology used for all the developed countries to do the report and report the data or the quantitative information that the finance that they're providing. So, but that is also some of the results or reports that we have gathered from our report. And also, we can see that we are still far from predictability of climate finance because if you put all the 26 countries together that we analyzed, we are at 54 billion, and we expect this figure to get to 100 billion. So we are still far from actually reaching the 100 billion targets annually. Although if you use the other sources of report like OECD that brings in the different blended climate finance, you'd see they're at, it's showing about 80 billion, but still the assessment here is only featuring the amount of finance from the developed countries without adding any other sources of finance from private sector and all that. So this is the overall assessment. And what we can see, like I said, in the criteria, each criteria has 4 points. And so the total point is basically 20 points that we use to analyze the different countries' performance. So the first one is Luxembourg. Currently, it's at 12 points using the 5 criteria that I've already shared. But due end of 2020, in the first report, they were at 11 points. So that means there's +1 in terms of their reporting to the future support of climate finance. We're also seeing that with New Zealand, currently at 12. In the last report, they were at 8, and therefore we are seeing there's considerable progress, +4 in terms of reporting, and being more specific on where the climate finance that they're providing would go to either adaptation or mitigation and all that. So quickly, just to highlight the few criteria that I've already shared with you, but to get more into the report in terms of future of level support. So we can see the good news is that the 20 Annex 2 parties now have quantitative climate finance targets. They're able to speak out more clearly in terms of we can follow what Denmark is providing, what Germany is providing, what Sweden is providing, and all other countries. We can also see that most represent a significant increase from the last report. With an exception of Japan, France, and Switzerland, that are still not yet, and the reporting it's still not indicating increase from the last number that, or the report that they produced. The bad news is that some Annex 2 parties are not on track to meet their climate finance targets. For example, the US, we know they pledged to provide about $11.4 billion. And following the current situation, we know they've already disbursed like 1 billion. There's 1 billion that was already pledged during the summit, but that one is still, and it has not been passed yet for it to be disbursed to the GCF, for example. So this is just one country, but we have a number of countries that are still far away in terms of meeting their targets and the commitments that they already provided. The numbers do not sum up to 100 billion. Like I said, from the report, we are at 57 billion, which is far from 100 billion USD. Currently, we are speaking about doubling adaptation finance. So we are really, in fact, far from it. So there's no assurance that the goal will be met, at least, and now we are in 2023. So by 2025, it's quite clear we are far from it that this goal will not be met. And then also to look quickly into the second criteria, which is the balance between adaptation and mitigation. In 2021, only 2 countries prioritized finance for adaptation. That was Ireland and New Zealand. They were very clear in terms of how much a percentage of the climate finance they're providing would go to adaptation and mitigation. But we've seen considerable increase in 2023. For example, we have new countries on board like Australia, Belgium, Denmark, and Netherlands have followed suit. For example, Denmark are proposing 60% of the climate finance to actually go to adaptation. And so that is good progress, because we are seeing that adaptation currently is still underfunded. From the recent IPCC science reports, we are seeing the gap between action and what is needed in terms of countries to adapt to impacts of climate change. So still we are not there, even if you look at the current climate finance, the big one, which is GCF. If you even look at the programs, but also how the climate finance is being, projects are being disbursed, is that still the adaptation is behind. And therefore, it's very important for us to try and strike that balance between adaptation and mitigation, because we can see the impacts of drought and other climate impacts to these developing countries. And finally, the four biggest contributors, Japan, France, Germany, and US, will spend less than half of their climate finance on adaptation from the report. So the balance is not in sight yet. We've seen this from the different reports, but also from the GCF annual reports that they do provide. And there's no plan for doubling adaptation finance towards 2025. We don't have more pledges yet, and we are hoping that probably as we move to COP28, we'll be able to see more countries coming up with more information or pledges of doubling adaptation finance. Yeah, also looking into the aspect of new and additional, how many countries have actually provided more than the 0.7 ODA that they do provide to developing countries. So currently we have only 3 countries, Sweden, Norway, and Luxembourg, verify that they'll make the climate finance contribution in addition to 0.7 UN development finance target. And so this is quite encouraging, because we need more new and additional to ensure that we're able to at least have enough adaptation finance, for example, to support the big gap that we are seeing currently. So this means that undertakings to provide more climate finance may in reality represent deductions from support for other development objectives. And that is actually not what we want to see. We do want to see finance from, let's say, health, education, actually deducted to support climate change, but this needs to be on top of what is already provided to support that, but more additional to support climate initiatives. So the situation is still the same from the last analysis that we did in 2021, and nothing has changed yet in terms of having new and additional climate finance. And I think the last slide. Yeah, thank you very much. So this is just a quick analysis of the Holo Commitments 2023 report. We haven't launched it yet, but we will launch it on 14th of June. So be on the lookout in our website and social channels. You'll get to have the full report and to have all the numbers, just to ensure that you're able to digest that quite well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marlene, for giving us insights on where the projections officially submitted by developed countries sum up to, and I think it clearly shows there's a big gap to fill on that side from government contributions. We could probably have a long discussion on that and how to pressure countries and how to find incentives that this is really lived up to. But we now would like to focus a bit more on an additional discussion about how to generate new and additional resources beyond the normal, let's say, government public finance contributions. And so with that, I would like to hand over to Rachel Simon from Can Europe, presenting new findings and insights on that matter.
Good afternoon, everyone. This presentation is going to focus on how to apply the polluter pays principle for new and additional sources of public climate finance, or what many people have been calling innovative sources, and I think probably many people in this room have been working on for many, many years. When I first started working on this piece of work this year, I received papers from 2010 on UNFCCC work on innovative sources, and many more over the last years as well. So we see real momentum to work on this year for many reasons. I mean, I think both in terms of the political and economic context and the energy price crisis and a shift in the narrative around fossil fuels, but also at the UNFCCC with the work of the loss and damage the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage Funding Arrangements, as well as an upcoming summit to be hosted by Macron and Modi in a couple of weeks in Paris, the new Global Financial Pact, which has this as a key theme. And of course, also the negotiations on the new climate finance goal, which are ongoing and taking place next week. So we really wanted to put the focus here on sources of public climate finance and look at both action in so-called developed countries to generate these resources, but also international commitments and policies that can benefit countries in the global south to generate resources domestically. So as Can Europe, we've been having a number of workshops with our network, partners and allies to look into this, and we'll have a report coming out actually in September. But for now, I'll just present a few ideas and our starting point, and it would be great to get your comments in the Q&A. So to start with the principles for designing effective policies, and we want to highlight that when it comes to climate justice and equity, this is not just about doing the right thing, it's also about increasing public acceptance of and also kind of supporting global political economy and coalition building around the right policies. And so what we really see as fundamental, of course, is the polluter pays principle. So it's both about generating revenue, but it's also about long-term climate goals and getting on a trajectory towards 1.5 and disincentivizing, for example, fossil fuels, polluting activities, towards phasing them out. So also instruments should really be supporting global equity and applying the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. We want to see that instruments result in a net transfer of new and additional public finance, and that finance is non-debt generating. So there's lots of other work being done on looking at debt cancellation, etc., and that's of course very important. But with this piece of work, we're focusing on that net transfer of public finance. And then finally, when it comes to the policies, really important is that in their implementation, they're avoiding regressive impacts, so social impacts, impacts on gender inequality, wherever they're implemented. Next slide. And then just some additional criteria that we have in mind for picking the policies is that, of course, the scale of finance that they can deliver is really important, because we've just heard from Marlene about the shortfalls in financing, and that's on mitigation and adaptation. Now we have the loss and damage funding arrangements and fund, where we need to get new and additional finance flowing. We also want to look at a selection of options, so we've got sustainability in mind, because also mindful of course, with some of these measures, then the revenue can change over time. Some of them might be temporary, some of them have a more permanent status, and that as well as international agreements, and there's quite a lot of emphasis on these at the moment. There are plenty of opportunities for action at national and regional level, and particularly with this, we're looking at the EU, and have got a whole host of suggestions of entry points for EU action. And finally, it's all very well to introduce a tax, but in order to ensure that it's effective and fair, there needs to be, and this here we call on the work of the tax justice movement, there needs to be a reform of kind of the global tax system, so that when countries do introduce a tax, try to generate revenue, that their tax base basically doesn't have somewhere to escape, that their tax base isn't eroded. And so here, particularly looking at the effort led by the African group on the the resolution towards a UN Convention on Tax, which was a resolution late last year. So just to start, a few options that we see at international level, and I think many of you will be quite familiar with these. Got some sources listed at the bottom, but the ones that we really see as key include potential around fossil fuel taxation, international maritime, aviation, and a wealth tax. So just briefly to comment on each of them in turn. I mean, there's many ways to look at how to tax fossil fuels, including revenue, tax on revenue, and we'll also go into an EU option in a minute. But there's been a long-standing campaign around a climate damages tax, which would really focus on extraction of fossil fuels and implement a levy per ton or cubic meter volume of fossil fuel, whatever it is. So that would put a fixed price, well, a price that could increase over time on extraction. And so this one we see as really, really adhering to climate justice and equity principles. In terms of global implementation, it's a long way off, but I definitely think that dialogue and coordination between countries could be key in advancing some kind of joint approach here. And when it comes to ensuring equity and justice, it's important to think about where that levy is implemented. So if, for example, it's implemented in a global north country, we would want to see a contribution to international climate finance from the revenues, whereas if it were implemented in a global south country, then it would be a good way to increase their domestic resources. The second one, when it comes to an international maritime levy, there's discussions are heating up at the International Maritime Forum. There's a whole package of climate measures, targets, and potentially an economic instrument, which countries are looking at introducing, and there's a key meeting in July. Interesting to hear, I mean, there have been proposals from the Marshall Islands previously, and now there are additional countries who are moving towards this proposal. Again, there's been quite a bit of work done on this, but various estimates available, including a paper from the World Bank in 2022, which look at how much revenue this could generate. Again, in implementing it, good to look at how the revenue could be divided, and also, if this meeting in July moves ahead, we could be looking at implementation around about 2027, 2028 for that levy. And then solidarity levy on aviation. Again, this is one that's come up in the transitional committee work, and this would involve looking at coalitions of countries that would be willing to introduce some kind of additional levy on aviation transport. So that one, I won't go into too much detail because I'm aware there's not much time. But yeah. And finally, wealth tax. A whole host of ways to look at how to tax the exorbitant wealth of not just billionaires, but the richest proportion of global society, which could include taxes on the richest 1%, but also taxes on inheritance, increased capital gains tax, and very, very high estimates if you look at multiple countries implementing that. And then just to go through the policy options at EU level, we have quite specific entry points here because the European Union is really motivated to pay off the huge loans that it's taken on as part of the recovery package that it implemented in response to COVID-19 and the economic crisis. So we've done quite a specific look at Can Europe at the various estimates for different tools at EU level. And there really are quite ready opportunities in the revision of the emissions trading system to increase contributions towards international climate finance. And of course, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a prime candidate, which is completely not complying with common but differentiated responsibilities right now. One way to remedy that could be looking at using revenues for international climate finance. And then I don't think I'll go into, okay, yeah, I'll go to the next slide. So just to finish with some recommendations, previous slide. Yeah, so just some recommendations when it comes to action at the UNFCCC on how to move forward on new and additional sources of finance. So this is definitely a combination of, in parallel, parties and civil society having strong strategies inside and outside the UNFCCC negotiations. It's about embedding those principles in UNFCCC decisions, but also in the implementation of policies. And so specifically thinking there about when it comes to, how we might divide the share of revenues of a tax or levy, and in the set of recommendations that the Transitional Committee will finalize ahead of COP28. And those should embed those principles and also give guidance on implementation outside the UNFCCC. Another entry point is the July dialogues on the third long-term goal of the Paris Agreement. And if we're talking about shifting financial flows and fossil fuel finance as an example, then a conception of what a subsidy is should encompass not just direct subsidies, but the negative externalities which aren't currently being paid for. And then just finally for the EU, that EU diplomatic efforts need to be really sensitive to and in line with these equity principles that I've set out. They need to be really doing active coalition building, having equity in mind, both on the multilateral policies, but let's definitely not forget all of those entry points to make a contribution to international climate finance from the new taxes and measures that are coming out at EU level. Any new source of finance, any new resources, should also be assigning some portion of revenue to international climate finance and the Loss and Damage Fund. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Rachel. We probably could discuss this for another hours and how to advance some of these sources. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that. But I think I can take 2 short questions/comments. No keynotes, please. We have a microphone somewhere, I think. So anyone who has a sharp question or comment to raise, we can take 2. And then we will have to move to the other panel. So I see a hand here. That colleague here in the 3rd row. And then another one in the back.
Well, thank you very much, the facilitator and the presenters. My question will go straight away to CARE International presentation. In your report, there is a positive upwards contribution from a certain amount of money to almost 54%, if I got it right. My question to you, whether you actually are able to link the contribution at the global level to the ground. What does mean on the ground? Is this flow from the global contribution reach the people who are really under distress due to climate change impact, either drought or floods? Thank you.
Thank you. The other microphone to the colleague in the back, please. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. When we talk about levies of imports and maritime transportation, and we talk about the polluter pays principle, which is basically reparations, how does that affect or not countries that are exporting, for example, in the case of the Global South, that exports or receives tourism as a main source of income when we talk about levies? And how is that displacing also the discussion from state responsibility here to other processes such as national legislation in terms of creating levies and taxes at the national level. So is it displacing the pressure here in terms of sources of finance, and how is that also, those levies and taxation will or not affect Global South countries that rely on exports and tourism?
Thank you. So we have one question for Marlene and then for Rachel. And so, yeah, please, to the speakers.
Yeah, thank you, Sven. So to your question on whether we are able to follow the climate finance scaling down to the community level. So if you look at the 5 criteria, one of them is the priority for the most vulnerable, and talking about the finance should be pro-poor. And this then translates to the different requirements that this finance has for accessing that. So if you look at, for example, I would give an example of GCF, how the different criteria, because the resources would actually, some of this would land to the GCF portfolio. So how are they involving, they have like a gender action plan, and how is the different groups actually involved in designing these proposals, implementing the proposals, learning, monitoring, and evaluation and learning. So through these different requirements that are set, for example, to ensure that, let's say, in the gender action plan, the different groups are actually part of it, we expect that through that, then when they're part of the designing of that proposal, they're able to clearly ensure that the priorities of the different needs at the local level where the program or the project will be implemented are well captured in the proposal. And therefore, when this is funded, this will actually be going directly to implement the needs that were already reflected in the proposal. So depending on the requirements for these proposals and ensuring that it's pro-poor, ensuring the different groups are actually part of the whole cycle in terms of design, implementing, monitoring, and learning, then you can be sure that these should be targeted, because working with all these groups to ensure that they're part of the process and they're implementing it, they're able to come up with learnings of what's working and what's not working, and give recommendation for the other upcoming, if it's proposals or calls, then we are able to try and ensure that it's actually getting to the ground. So we have not done the tracking at the national level, but a general example, because CARE, we've implemented a GCF program for 6 years in 10 African countries. So the example I'm sharing is basically the learnings that we have gathered from this GCF project implementation in 10 African countries. Thank you.
So in response to the question about the levy, so yeah, I mean, countries at the IMO have to come up with, all have to come up with an agreement that works for them. Definitely, I mean, what I mentioned in terms of the use of the revenues could be different depending on the nature of the country, and for example, as you mentioned, its reliance on exports or on tourism, for example. But I think we would recommend a universal levy rather than seeing exemptions for certain countries. But revenue, I think, would be a very useful resource to then invest in cleaning up shipping, but also into greening a harbour infrastructure and ports, which is definitely something that those countries need to happen as well. And in terms of the international agreement versus national implementation, and maybe, sorry, I'll also just say that it's quite a few countries that are responsible for a huge proportion of international shipping imports and exports. So the EU is, or as a region, the EU is amongst them. So I think that's also something to keep in mind. And in terms of implementation, I mean, indeed, we're thinking about this at EU level because the EU has certain measures in place when it comes to shipping and aviation as well. So any decision at the IMO needs to, the EU then needs to revise and align its regulation towards that. But the IMO has the remit over international shipping rather than the kind of intra country or regional. Thanks.
Thank you very much. With that, I would like to conclude the first part of the panel and hand over to our colleagues from DEval for setting up the second session. And I hope you all will be continuing the discussion and contributing, and wish you a good rest of the side event. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, while we're setting up here, just to show you how well we are coordinated, my name is also Sven. I'm also German. Not as handsome as this one, and wearing a different suit, but for the rest, welcome to this session. I'm going to start right away with the introduction, because I'm aware that I'm standing sort of between you and drinks and dinner, and after a long and tiring day. So we heard a lot about numbers and the importance of numbers and policy options. I've got the honor to be sitting here and also virtually with some really esteemed colleagues. I'm not going to introduce them. You can find them on LinkedIn. You see the program. But basically, what we share is also with the other group, as we're researchers, we're evaluators, and we're going to look at what evidence actually is there beyond the numbers, how effective the financing really is. So what did we actually learn in terms of how just and transformational climate financing is, and we look at bilateral and multilateral examples. And first in line is my colleague Andreas, who's from the GCF. Everything else you'll find on LinkedIn. Andreas, in 7 minutes, what is actually transformational change? You know, in 7 minutes, according to the experience to the GCF. What is there beyond the numbers in your experience as an independent evaluator at the IEU? Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. I think I'm audible. Yeah. Thank you, Sven, for this question. Again, great to be here. Great to have such an interesting panel. We've just been saying it's all men up here. This doesn't mean climate finance is a male affair. It is obviously a affair for everyone. I should need a lot more. I should need at least 70 minutes to explain what transformational change would mean and how is that linking to adaptation. I'll try it in 3 main points, and I hope I manage to do it within less than 7 minutes. So I brought to you today 3 points that I wanted to talk about when thinking about transformational change and paradigm shift at the Green Climate Fund, and then linking that to adaptation. 3 points come into mind. One is an institutional question. It's an institutional and a climate funds landscape question. The second one, transformational change. What is this, right? How do we capture it? And the third point that I want to make is complex adaptation. So just to get to the first one, I think we've heard it already from Marlene and Rachel a bit. And I think we all are aware of that. We have certain shortfalls when we come to climate finance. The issue, generally speaking, is we do not have enough public finance to satisfy all the needs that we have with regards to the fight of climate change. We need the private sector. And the delays in the engagement with the private sector has spurred calls for looking at a more systematic way of dealing with climate change issues. And that to us is exactly what the GCF is trying to look at. The GCF aims at, and I'm quoting a little bit from the governing instrument of the GCF, if you don't mind, it's to mobilize such actions in promoting a paradigm shift in low emission and climate resilient development pathways. So this is, in a nutshell, what the GCF is all about. It's trying to achieve paradigm shift in both these ends, the low emission end as well as the climate resilient development pathways. So now, how do we capture it? We looked at Scientifically, we looked at this question, my unit looked at this question of, okay, how can we make sense of what paradigm shift is? And what does that mean versus transformational change? What we found in 2018 is that it is used interchangeably in the climate finance space. All the climate finance, climate funds that we know are using these terms interchangeably and do not make any differences in its definition. Institutionally, here at the GCF, at the Green Climate Fund, we try to address the question of climate financing through 6 investment criteria, which is impact, paradigm shift, sustainable development, recipient needs. We talked about this just earlier, that we need to think about the recipients that we want to reach, country ownership, because we need country-owned processes, as well as effectiveness and efficiency. But the fact is, the GCF has not defined the concept of paradigm shift. And we're not alone. Our study has also shown that all the major climate actors and climate funds do not have a clear definition of what paradigm shift is or what transformational change is. This is both a positive and a negative. The positive side is obviously it provides enough flexibility to countries to define that in their contexts, in their climate struggle. But on the other hand, it also creates a lack of clarity on what we exactly want and how to achieve that goal. And we've heard this from Arlene, a great feedback coming to one of the questions that we've heard. It's a question of how do we define the funding proposals? How do we define the needs that we have? The GCF indicates that paradigm shift is to some degree the degree to which the fund can achieve a sustained development impact beyond a one-off, something that's scalable and something that's replicable. We've used this to look at a study and try to identify the different ways, and here I come to my second point. So institutionally, we know already it's not defined. There's lots of issues, flexibility, yes, but obviously clarity, issues with clarity is one. The second point that I said to you that I wanted to make today is the question transformational change. So what is it? So the IU, my unit has done a study, and we've done several studies, an evidence review, a global evidence review to take stock of what we know so far, as well as a study that tries to decipher a little bit of how could we then define it and break it down in components. And what we found in 2021 is that transformational change in climate projects is most often defined by the various degrees to which we can inform the following 8 factors. Number 1, scale. It's the question of delivering a large impact, the question of large effect sizes. I'm sure we will be speaking about this very, very soon with these bright guys next to me. The question of depth. You know, when you say, okay, it's not only the question of a large area, a multitude of beneficiaries, but also a large effect size in a way that it's going deep down and changes the paradigm. And another question is complementarity and coherence. It can only work if it really is a coherent approach, a complementary approach with other actors. The permanence, which can also be translated as duration, is the question of impacts need to remain over a credible amount of time, over at least, we say, 3 years as in the evaluation space. The demonstration ability, so the question of replicability and scalability needs to be addressed. Behavioral change, policy change, and innovation. So those were the 8 to run through very quickly. Please get in touch with me later on if you want to know more about it. But in essence, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to try these components and try to assess now how far has the GCF and other organizations come, right? And for us, these 8 made the most sense. We tried to engage with all the stakeholders in the space, try to see what people think about when they think about paradigm shift. And I know, I'm sure, people from Kyrgyzstan have 50 ideas when I only ask the one question, what is paradigm shift? So to the third question, so what do we find? What is it that we found actually when we looked at the projects at the GCF? So we've done a study in 2022 to look at this, and I could only title this as complex adaptation. So when we looked at the question of transformational change, we found the following. Transformational change, or the question or the realization of transformational change, is very closely linked to the concept of innovation and innovativeness of an idea. and that all the level up in a spectrum, all the level up to the question of risk of implementing this idea. So you got to be a risk taker in this space in order to really foster a wider paradigm shift. To our surprise, when we looked at the GCF portfolio, adaptation projects are far more likely to be transformational. That was a huge surprise to us because we always thought, you know, mitigation, the stuff that we've done for many, many years is rather clear and stronger in effect. But essentially, it's not, it's adaptation that has the stronger likelihood. But I should say we looked at all these 8 criteria, and not all the projects satisfy all the 8 criteria at the same time. So some are more innovative, others are looking more at the permanence and at the depth and the scalability. So it varies, of course, across the different projects. So that should be very clear. But what we found when we looked a little bit deeper, especially for adaptation projects and projects that try to combine adaptation with mitigation, we found they have a greater need and a greater expectation for behavioral change. So they truly think beyond, is it only that infrastructure that we want to build, or is it the infrastructure plus the human element that we need to bring in, where we need to get adoption? I'll close very, very briefly. I know I get this already. So why did I say complexity? What we found in adaptation project is that they try to look at actors, the human ankle, the environmental ankle, and they try to look at all the different actors and sectors that they would touch with a single project. And that's very different to mitigation projects in general. At least that's been the finding with us. Let me close by saying what we still need, and we're coming back to this, is the comparative advantage for a fund like ours and for other funds is to look now at adaptation far stronger and look at the question, how can we get the private sector to this table, to this conversation, and really truly find the catalytic potential that we have in this space. I've spoken enough of this. I'm really glad to be here and looking at the future discussions to come. Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. Laura, virtually, are you with us? Can you hear us?
I am, yes.
Yeah, great. Wow, amazing. So, Laura, as a researcher, you looked at GCF. So please tell us what is right and what different views do you have on what Andreas has said? Specifically, what can we learn from GCF's experience on working on transformational change? And for the rest of the panel, guys, you have 3 minutes because we're going, or some of us are going to Dubai, and I imagine lots of high buildings, lots of elevators. So this is sort of practicing elevator pitches in 3 minutes. Very high buildings. All right, Laura, over to you.
All right, in 3 minutes, let's see what I can say. So first of all, I just want to say that a lot of the research that I've been doing really echoes the findings that Andreas spoke about, and there's lots to get into in terms of what types of transformation align well with the funding criteria of the GCF, and perhaps what are some types of transformation that are a little bit harder to make proposals that clearly articulate that transformational potential in ways that are sort of legible to the fund. And this is findings that are coming from our analysis in 2 ways. One, we've been looking at kind of narrative analysis of project proposals, of how do applicants describe the transformational potential of their own projects. And then from the other side, we've been doing an analysis of what do the board meeting deliberations reveal about the tensions that come up in determining whether to fund projects and whether they meet that transformational potential. So I just want to kind of give you one high-level highlight, and then I want to turn to reflect on kind of the second part of this question, which is what might be some of the lessons for loss and damage. So in terms of transformational adaptation in particular, one of the things that we found is that these criteria of scalability and replicability, which Andreas was just talking about, really feature prominently in the ways that the deliberations amongst the board are going on the proposals. Andreas listed 8 different criteria. We really found that those dominated the discussions. And this has important implications for what kinds of activities and what kinds of investments are easier to articulate that scalability and replicability. What we found was that mechanisms that talked about market transformations, transformation that engaged sort of new market opportunities, economic opportunities, really fared very well. So lots more to say on that. I'll turn now to what are some of the implications that we found from our analysis of the GCF for loss and damage. And these really, I'll focus on more process questions. I think there's a lot in terms of content as well. But one process question, and this is front of mind, I'm sure for many with the discussions on how to set up a loss and damage facility, is that the GCF obviously is one of the key models for an institutional arrangement for loss and damage. And what we found is that even though there's equal representation of developed and developing countries on the board, when you look at the deliberations around proposals, we found a huge imbalance of which actors were speaking. We coded 409 concerns raised by developed country board members and only 147 from developing country board members. So this really raises questions about how do we ensure that process actually aligns with the goals of fair representation in the board. That's one point. And then one other thing that I'll just mention is that we found in our analysis that the role of observers was really, really important in holding the board accountable and holding proposals accountable for what types of transformation are included in the project, and also what kinds of risks and harms projects might be including, and sort of suggesting ways to improve the projects before approval. So certainly something important to keep in mind, that critical role that observers play in helping to improve the quality of the portfolio. I'll turn it back to you.
Great, Laura. Thanks for those really insightful remarks. So Alper, over to you. Where are you at? There you are. Okay. Yes. So we're sticking with the multilateral perspective, specifically an MDB where you work. So what does independent evidence tell us about the effectiveness of climate financing?
Sven, thank you. My name is Alper Dinçer. I am from Independent Evaluation Department of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Again, I start thanking to the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. Basically, what I say here depends on two main sources of information. The first one is like a review of all of the reports of independent evaluation departments of multilateral development banks that they did between 2010 and 2020 that is related to climate finance. And then one very recent internal review of what we did at EBRD about how we understand transition to a low carbon economy, how we measure it, and how we capture impact. So that is looking at that period of independent evaluation reports from 2010 and 2020. Essentially, we found that first, projects that have good in measuring and monitoring their own outputs and outcomes, they are more likely to be successful. So that was one key finding. And then I think we screened 108 projects. And then what we see is that in climate adaptation projects, those projects are much more likely to have better measurement and monitoring. And climate adaptation projects are much less likely to have good measurement and monitoring. Indeed, what we typically see is that there isn't much advanced thinking about measurement and monitoring in climate adaptation projects compared to climate mitigation projects. So that is one thing, maybe to mobilize more and to attract more donor funding, maybe private capital might be to invest more in measurement and monitoring in climate adaptation. The second element and then our own internal review also showed that, and that was very close indeed to what Andreas just said. I mean, EBRD has very ambitious about creating what we say in EBRD systemic change. So this is just another concept for us to study, I guess. And definitely shareholders, as well as our own management, we want to create systemic change, that change that goes beyond the project itself, that is sustained, that has sustainable, and then it creates deep impact. But at the same time, the tools for us to measure and monitor our own climate impact, it is mainly geared towards tracking the finance itself, but not the actual impact 2 years or 3 years down the line. So that's I think also a thing that we have recently learned from our internal review. So now we are launching a second phase of that work. We will look deeper into that. And then we will try to learn from others. Maybe within our institution, there might be also sources of innovation on that front as well. 2 very brief points when I know I'm running out of time. One point is concessionality. For climate mitigation and climate adaptation projects, we are not making we are not having a differentiated perspective. Climate adaptation projects are systematically have a much larger viability gap. So if we are willing to attract private financiers at MDBs, we have to need a different perspective about how we use concessionality. So maybe we need a much more intentional strategic thinking about which projects we are willing to subsidize more. So that is one core thing, I guess, for finance. The other one is MDB collaboration. Again, collaboration of multilateral development banks when they do climate mitigation and climate adaptation projects and how they differ. And indeed, there were also evidence on that. MDBs are much better in collaborating if it's a climate mitigation project. If it's, let's say, if it is convincing a government to do a power purchase agreement and then establish this funding policies and regulations for that, MDBs they are performing well. They are dealing very well with local stakeholders. They're open to listen, as well as to private sector as well. But looking at MDB collaboration at climate adaptation, it is not that good. And now there is a lot of coordination around Paris Agreement within MDBs. And I think that coordination maybe can also have a focus on climate adaptation and then how to attract private sector to that space. And I guess that could help as well. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Well, excellent. I think lots of food for discussion and for thought. Thank you, Alper, for those critical remarks. So switching now to a bilateral donor, Martin, what is your experience in looking at adaptation finance? Is the situation similar to what we've just heard? And in particular, how can we transform climate finance allocation for climate resilience? So please share some thoughts with us. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Sven, and many thanks to my colleagues here. So please let me share 2 additional points to add on to the ongoing debate here at this table that stem from an evaluation which was a great opportunity actually because we accompanied German portfolio development of its international adaptation finance over a period of 5 years by an evaluation and with different modules. And with around $20 billion US over the period of the last 10 years, Germany committed the most adaptation-related funding within the OECD group of member countries, and with current annual commitments that sum up to more than 2 billion euro annually from budget fund alone. It's one of the largest donors in the EU. And however, despite this significant financial contribution, the international finance gap is widening. That's what we learned already in the first part of our session. And it's widening due to sharply increasing climate risks in many of the partner countries of German development cooperation. And in this context, the German objective to increase its international climate finance, but also adaptation finance, to 6 billion euros by new commitments by 2025 is reasonable, and half of it should go to adaptation. And I think CARE will watch out if this really comes true in the next coming years. However, the objective of adaptation interventions cannot solely be met by increasing the amount of funding. According to the findings of our evaluation, it comes to the necessity to realign adaptation finance to make it effective and impactful. So, and this means first to include or to channel finance to the most effective instruments, such as nature-based solutions and infrastructure interventions. And second, it also includes to allocate more funding to particularly climate vulnerable countries and small island developing states, particularly also when responding to losses and damages. When the financing of intervention should be more aligned actually and systematically more aligned to climate risk, but also the priority of partner countries and the needs of the final beneficiaries. So this was my first point on realigning adaptation finance. And the second is on promoting a just transition. And there, in summary, our evaluation shows, as it's also true for other many bilateral donors, that we see a lot of progress and a lot of incremental change. But for responding to the climate crisis, we all know that we need a more fundamental transformation. And this means that for development cooperation, we have to promote substantial socioeconomic changes and make significant contributions to development pathways that are more inclusive and resilient. And this also means that we make use of climate risk analysis, for example, and innovative country strategies to increase the transformative relevance of our interventions, but also to reach scale. We had the scale discussion already. And for example, with climate and development partnerships, we may have the opportunity to contribute also to fundamental systemic change. So in light of this, our evaluation derives the implication that we should create innovation spaces to really advance transformative adaptation approaches, to bring all that we have debated in the last years into a more practical way for a transformative change perspective for partner countries and other development actors. Thank you so much, Sven.
Thank you, Martin. So, Stefan, help me out with one thing. I mean, now we're moving back sort of to the more general level with the two last remaining presentations. I mean, we're talking about money to sort of support coping with the effects of climate change. Why on earth do we need to distinguish between sort of adaptation finance, loss and damage finance? I mean, you know, is that not all money for the same goal? And are we making things too complicated, perhaps also for policymakers? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sven. And that's certainly a very fair question to ask. I get to it immediately. Just first, let me also thank you for hosting this session. And while I will not apologize for being male myself, I should acknowledge and note, and also to your credit as organizers, that you had originally invited my colleague Maria Alexandrova, which would make the session a little less male. But for the logistical and division of labor reasons of the ESBs, you have to live with me for the time of this session. That also gave me some time to think more about your question. So now, fun aside, it is a good question to ask. And for starters, I would like to say, if we talk about transformational change, I mean, let us be clear that the transformational force, or what qualifies as a transformational force, certainly is climate change impacts, whether we like that or not. And that has, of course, far-reaching implications as to how we approach the climate change impacts. And that's where the distinction between adaptation and loss and damage kicks in, and why it is important. It may seem a technical thing, but it is relevant in practice and not least politically. And what is of help there is the tediously negotiated phrasing of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And it's no coincidence that this has been the outcome of the negotiations, and it even makes sense. So what I would say is that in many ways, averting loss and damage is the ultimate objective of mitigation. And I take the liberty to also quote Salim Haq, whom I believe many of you will know, who has put it in a recent op-ed of his, and here I quote, "What we called mitigation before is now better described as averting or avoiding loss and damage," end of quote. And then from that stance, adaptation in turn is about minimizing loss and damage. That is minimizing loss and damage is including the material as well as the non-material costs that loss and damage incurs. And accordingly, if we discuss adaptation finance, which is at the heart of this session, then adaptation finance is what is invested with the aim to minimize loss and damage, whereas finance mobilized and then indeed eventually spent to address losses and damages, then loss and damage finance is essentially dealing with the increasingly obvious limits of adaptation. And they are resulting, amongst many things, from incremental slow onset effects that also receive way too little attention under the current, say, adaptation discourse, where there's a lot of climate risk management that is addressing primarily the short-term and sudden onset events. And then, yeah, and if I have time for one more point, I would like to also emphasize in the context that when we discuss transformational adaptation, or no, I'm starting the other way around, it's evident that transformational adaptation, like all of climate policy, is very urgent. We have no time to waste. And still, it is important that even when we emphasize the urgency of the matter and call for swift action, swift mobilization of resources, etc., it is also imperative with respect to transformational adaptation that we recognize and avoid the many pitfalls of maladaptation, which could collaterally make things worse and contribute to inequalities and losses and damage, indeed. And because of that, and that would be my last point, it is really important that we also afford, in spite of the urgency, to thoroughly consider the root causes of vulnerability in given socio-economic and social-cultural contexts, primarily, but not exclusively, at local levels, even as we seek to accelerate action. And that is also what we are doing more and more research on now at IDOS. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Stefan. So, Jonas, over to you for the closing remarks. Talking about perhaps the most important question of all, how can this financing be made more just, and how can we sort of also start on more just pathways? So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I think when you are calling the last speaker, it's always important to say last but not least. On a light note, I'll make 2 points which are critical in the interest of time. Number one is that the current climate finance structures, and especially for adaptation, is characterized by a lot of injustices. Injustices in the sense that public finance is actually not reaching the most vulnerable communities. In some of the work we've done in some African countries, we find that about 80% of funding that has been committed to adaptation basically remain at the national level, supporting the establishment of institutions and capacity building of the officers at the national level. So you end up with about 5%, because 15% is always around the bureaucracies and the cost, the operations cost around trying to devolve this fund. So basically, what we see is that the most vulnerable communities, or most vulnerable people who really should benefit from the climate finance, are actually not getting the financing as necessary. So that's one source of injustice. The second source of injustice is with regards to private finance, and it's great that colleagues from the private sector are here. The instruments that are being supported or being promoted through private finance sometimes are not friendly to the marginalized and, the vulnerable communities. I mean, we're talking about some instruments such as loans, instruments such as, profit-driven perspective. Because the private sector, as we are all agreeing, will not be able to invest in adaptation if there is no profit that is associated with that investment. And that is another source of injustice. So what we are seeing by and large is a situation whereby the existing funding structures are already very, characterized by a lot of injustices. Now, if you reflect this in the context of the loss and damage funding, the big question that we might have is that how can loss and damage really avert some of these injustices? And I think for developing countries, there's a huge opportunity here. The greatest opportunity that is there is the fact that loss and damage funding is based on rights. So it's about the right to be able to access these particular fundings. It's about the damages that have been caused. And if you think about the damages, most of these damages have happened, within the local communities who are very vulnerable. So how do we ensure that the loss and damage funding is actually aligned to the local community needs? So one of the options that perhaps we could think about is how do we begin to build some locally led matrices, which basically tries to kind of profile the interests of the local community, the aspirations of local communities in these particular funding opportunities. And I know, of course, we have the loss and damage funding. The risk that this fund is actually going to follow the same systems which have imposed injustices is very high. How do we avert that particular risk? That's a big question that we need to think about as we, try to differentiate and try to ensure that, financing for adaptation actually makes sense to the most vulnerable communities where it is needed. Thank you very much.
So, esteemed colleagues, we have time for two quick questions. Lady over there and over there. No, the first two here. You were the quickest, and there should be a mic down here.
Thank you. My question is very short. How do you organise a panel on transformational adaptation with 6 male speakers and so heavily northern biased?
Fair enough.
Actually, I was following up on that. No, but it's mostly related. I really appreciate the last point said on climate justice. And also, I was taking part in a loss and damage workshop taking place around a month ago. And it's more referring not only about the panel, but if you're a representative, I'm not blaming exactly who organized the event, but probably sometimes also a systemic issues on the top. So can we maybe ensure quota? I mean, according to your experience, maybe how many women work in the evaluation sector? So should we maybe have, again, maybe a female quota to encourage more women to be engaged in the sector and be easily invited to this type of events? So just a suggestion.
Jeremy Anderson from the International Transport Workers Federation. Andreas, you were talking about the factors involved in transformational adaptation. How do you make sure that just transition for workers and other stakeholders is guaranteed in that definition?
Well, thank you so much, the panel. My question is the Green Climate Fund. What is your position in nature-based solution transformation? I mean, what is the relationship, and how do you support nature-based solution. Thank you.
Okay. So let me respond. Can't really respond to the first two points. I mean, you're absolutely right. So in the end, the planning was different. We had cancellations. We looked for last-minute replacements. What do you do? We could have canceled the sessions. Maybe we should have. The only thing I can, yes, try harder. Yeah. The only thing I can do is apologize for this setup. I hope the content was still interesting to you. Next time we'll try harder, or we'll perhaps cancel this one. Believe me, it's I guess I'm speaking for all the persons being present on the panel and virtually. This is also for us not pleasant. So we would have liked to be different. But yeah, so my apologies for that. And then Andreas, we've got 2 questions for you.
Thanks. I like the idea of the quota, actually. I really do. We look at that as the GCF at the moment. Happy to report that at least the management has said 67% of staff members of the GCF are female. But you're absolutely right with your comments. On the workers' right and the human rights and how to integrate them, I think this is the question for Just Transition. It is something that's coming up. I don't want to go into much depth with it because we have a second event tomorrow from 1:30 to 2:30 in the other building, in the room H202, where we're going to ask the question, what is the strategy of the GCF for the next period? And one of these things is very, very closely linked to this question of just transition. So we're looking at this question of how to build in these necessary questions of justice, climate justice and climate equity into the programs beyond the current point. And to the current point, just to give you that feedback as well, when we think about human rights, when we think about workers' rights, we always talk about the environmental and social safeguards of organizations. Same as every organization in the climate space, or most of them at least, we have our own environmental and social safeguards. We actually, as a fund, we oblige all the accredited entities that work with us and implement projects on the ground to do the same. They would not have a project if they don't have these safeguards in place. But here it goes with safeguards. Safeguards always stop at this question of do no harm. But they never go beyond and say, how do we do good? So it stops at this question of do no harm, which is fine, the compliance part, but we need to start thinking about co-benefits. We need to start going beyond this question of how can we comply? We need to create that space where we say, what are the environmental, the social, and the economic benefits, co-benefits of projects in the climate space? That's one of the key questions that we're asking the fund to do, and it is also got to do with this question of just transition. So we're very much on track in terms of policy, but we're not there yet to say, okay, how are we showing that we go beyond the do no harm rule? Nature-based solutions, the definition, and I'm sorry, I'm not representing the entire fund. Here I'm representing the unit, the independent evaluation unit, but speaking for the fund, we've defined it through ecosystem services. I know that, especially at the CBD, this question of nature-based solution is a very big one. It's also a very political one. For the GCF, however, we haven't found a way other than targeting our investments through the result areas framework. So we've got 8 result areas, 4 for adaptation, 4 for mitigation. And ecosystem services, and providing ecosystem services is the definition that we would use, and it comes the closest to this question of nature-based solutions. But you're absolutely right in when you're asking how are we addressing questions of biodiversity, going beyond this, thinking about nature-based solutions, next step, how do we integrate biodiversity? The fund has just recently released a document to try to position itself a little bit better. We know that sister funds and brother funds, sister funds, such as the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, we're not there yet. The GEF is obviously better positioned to address biodiversity concerns because it speaks to the different conventions. We only speak to the UNFCCC convention, which limits the GCF a little bit, but there are ways of doing this in the future, and we hope to increase those type of investments in the future. Thanks.
If I may I just briefly chime in on the nature-based solutions and transformation question? From our analysis of the GCF and the portfolio, we're increasingly seeing proposals making that case for the transformational potential of nature-based solutions. And I think we'll see more and more of this in the GCF portfolio moving forward. One of the challenges, I think, is how to ensure that this is truly transformational and isn't simply a substitution of nature-based solutions for very traditional approaches. And we've been analyzing some of the concerns around, is this going to support, is it going to be climate just? Is it going to support the most marginalized? Or is it going to be kind of particularly around carbon finance and carbon markets and some of the concerns there? I think those are things to look up for.
And then very quickly, I could also elaborate on the nature-climate nexus more, but just to add on to what Laura just has said, which I would totally echo, it also resonates with the point that I had been making about maladaptation. I mean, whether you call it nature-based solution or otherwise, it's very prone to maladaptation, and these risks need to be anticipated and considered. It's one of the most prominent areas where maladaptation occurs, and because of the long-term nature of many of these nature-related solutions, is also critically important to reflect them. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly to respond to the question around justice. I think rethinking the climate, finance infrastructure, especially for adaptation, we must be intentional in terms of investing in structures that could help to devolve climate financing to the local level. So at the moment, those structures are lacking because a lot of investments are left at the sort of interest of governments, but also at the national level players. And there is no attention as to whether this money really reaches the ground. So some intentional investment to see that there are structures that could, link communities to the national systems in terms of financing, I think would help to, push the justice idea.
Okay, with that, thank you for your attendance, and next time we'll do better.